the Civil Rights Commission was actually set up by law. It was set up by the '57 Civil Rights Act, and there were specific guidance on having Democrats and Republicans on it. So by design, I mean, you could argue perhaps that the designers of the law maybe foresaw that this would stall any action, but Eisenhower himself had no such illusions. In fact, this is very consistent with Eisenhower's whole philosophy. I mean, Eisenhower believed if you got people in a room, you could come to some sort of a reasonable agreement. And of all the pieces of the Civil Rights Act of 1957, that was probably the one he was most excited about. He really thought there was great promise in the commission. In fact, he was so excited about the commission that one of the very first people he wanted to put on it was Adlai Stevenson, his opponent in 2 campaigns. And interestingly enough, Stevenson turned him down. But Eisenhower really thought that people could reason together. And when you read his letters and his diary entries, he talks a lot about, as I said earlier, not inflaming passions with bully pulpit speeches, but getting people to talk together. He also thought it was a great idea, and he met with Billy Graham several times about this, to have ministers give sermons about loving your neighbor as yourself. He thought that that was very important, that people, it was more important that people hear it from their pastor than they hear it from their president. Now, I'm somewhat critical of him in the book on the rhetorical piece of this. I think that he underestimated the role that the bully pulpit can play. And if your theory is that you have to do more than change laws, you have to change hearts and minds, and those are his words, then you ought to do something to change hearts and minds as well. You ought to speak up a little bit more. But he saw things like the Civil Rights Commission as changing hearts and minds. And so he actually, from my reading of his writings and his diary entries and his letters around 1957, I have to tell you, I think he had great hopes for the Civil Rights Commission, and I think was disappointed in it.
Great, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Over here, Richard.
Yeah.
Yes.
2 questions. One is there a little bit of the 19th century clinging to Eisenhower and his approach to presidential power and the limitations thereof? And the second part, not unrelated to the first, is to what extent do you think, not only in this issue, but across the board, the kind of president he was, particularly with the rhetorical limitations, was a conscious or unconscious reaction to Roosevelt and Truman?
It was a very conscious reaction to Roosevelt and Truman. I found a quote, and I think I put it in the book. He talks about what he saw as the excesses of particularly Roosevelt, who he liked personally and worked very well with during the war. But he saw Roosevelt, and I think these were his words, as essentially usurping powers, that he tried to do too much. And Eisenhower, in many ways, he is a throwback. He is a pre-New Deal president. He think about how he set up the White House. I mean, think about how he set up the office. He set it up like a military operation. He's the first president to have a chief of staff. So he had, a huge staff operation where there were, processes and policy was formulated, as opposed to, just sort of him deciding and making decisions on instinct or belief. He very much wanted to administrate and be a manager and run the government like a business. He was very impressed with business people. He had many of them in his cabinet. He had many of them as informal advisors and friends. So I think in many ways he is a throwback. I mean, it's ironic because a lot of the White House structure we have today, particularly the Chief of Staff system, comes from Eisenhower. But he is a throwback to, in some ways, the 19th century.
Then why, it's curious, why in 1952 is he seen as the great hope of liberals? And indeed, ironically, 60 years later, why is he written off by so many movement conservatives as a closeted liberal?
Well, I think part of it is changing over time. I mean, I think in 1952, you have to remember the grassroots movement affection for Taft was enormous. I mean, he was Mr. Republican. That was his name. And they had so convinced themselves that 1952 would be his year to win the presidency. So when Eisenhower shows up at the convention and wins the delegates, there's a little bit of resentment that's, I think, sort of lasted for a while. On the other hand, Eisenhower is hard to put into a category. He, in many ways, I mean, think about some of the policy initiatives of the Eisenhower administration. He's a free trader. Well, in 1952, free traders were not considered conservative. Now they are. I mean, Ronald Reagan was a free trader. And so in many ways, it's kind of hard to categorize him, but he very much wanted to be a Cold Warrior. He very much wanted, and I talk about this in the book, all of this is in some way related to the context of fighting the Cold War. He didn't think it was very likely, although a lot of the New Deal bugged him, he didn't think it was very likely that you could repeal very much of it, and so a lot of conservatives have objected that he didn't do enough to repeal the New Deal. I mean, I think that was the correct political decision. I don't think he could have repealed much of it. And so he's just very hard to put into categories, and he's never really had a natural home for that reason. I mean, there's not a big Eisenhower following out there of young people like there are for Reagan or Kennedy, say.
You can't exactly put a label on the interstate highway system.
Well, yeah. No, and the interstate highway system was something he was very excited about. I mean, he saw that as, again, going back to, you know, Henry Clay in some ways, you know, I mean, the American system, that this is a legitimate function of government, to have an infrastructure that allows goods and services and people to move around. And by the way, in case of national emergency, he saw it as a national security issue as well.
One last thing, then do you think today, would he be critical of government for failing to maintain infrastructure?
I think he would. No, I absolutely think he would. And I think the question I get asked a lot about Eisenhower today is, you know, what would he think of the world? And it's very hard to put words into his mouth. I do think, and I talk about this a lot in the book, he had a very fundamentally conservative view of the world and the nature of man. He very much believed that this is a fallen world, that this is a broken world, that there are limits to what kinds of improvement you can implement. And I think that he would have a very humble look on a whole host of issues, as he did during his presidency. He didn't think that government could necessarily fix things. He thought that perhaps in certain areas it could be helpful and it could bring about incremental change, but he never doubted for a minute that you could not create heaven on earth. As you know, I think that's part of what I read earlier. His criticism of LBJ was the notion that we're going to fix all of these problems and wipe them out overnight. He thought that was crazy, and ran counter to the nature of human beings. So I think he would look at today's issues with a very healthy dose of conservatism, that there are limits to what government can do. But as far as the roads, I think he absolutely would think that that's a government priority and it ought to be kept better.
You have a question on the right?
Yes, right here.
Okay, you mentioned that he desegregated the military,
Mm-hmm.
which meant that black soldiers and white soldiers and all ethnic groups were hopefully able to interact and
Right.
be together. Was that sustainable when they returned to the States? You talked about he's able to do incremental,
Right.
you know, advancements.
You're talking about at the end of World War II?
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
That's a great question, and I talk about this at length in the book. And this is kind of why I mentioned earlier that sort of there were these unintended consequences that he didn't even realize. I mean, the War Department went and studied what happened and decided this worked pretty well, and eventually that leads to the Truman Executive Order. Eisenhower himself, however, returns from the war and is still very nervous about it. He doesn't doubt that the experiment worked. He doesn't doubt that that's where the future is, but he's very nervous about pronouncing that we're going to have fully integrated units, and indeed gives some testimony to Congress in 1948 where he kind of hedges a little bit on how fast that change should happen. So, and this is one of the great stories of America. I mean, you can be a leader and set in force a series of events that are bigger than you are. And that's what he did at the Bulge. And eventually he comes around in the 1952 campaign and basically says, okay, the time is now and this should be done. But he is a little hesitant at the end of the war about radically changing all of the Army. I think he saw the Bulge as a crisis situation. He needed troops. It makes sense. Let's send them in, and they did very well. And I don't know that he fully acknowledged the extent to which the change needed to happen right away. He eventually gets there, but it takes him a little while.